below the foothills of southwest Persia lie productive formations containing millions of tons of crude oil. Directly above the oil is a cap or layer of high-pressure gas which supplies the energy to force the oil to the surface of the earth through steel pipes with which the well bores have been lined. At a well site, when drilling is in progress, one can see the neat stacks of drill pipe and casing close by the familiar tall derrick. The derrick is required in order that long sections of drill pipe and casing may be raised and lowered in the process of drilling the well. On the derrick floor is the hoisting gear and a turntable which grips and rotates the drill pipe. Immediately below the derrick floor is the well cellar, open-sided for ease of access. The cellar contains the top of the casing on which the wellhead is mounted. This wellhead consists of a master valve and a number of smaller valves which control the drilling fluid and will eventually control the oil when drilling has been completed and the rig has been removed. The most delicate and dangerous part of the drilling operation begins when the drill starts to cut through the last few feet of cap rock immediately above the formation which contains the highly inflammable gas and oil. To prevent the gas from blowing up through the drill pipe or well casing while the drill is progressing, a mud slurry of sufficient weight is pumped down the hollow drill shaft to counterbalance the pressure of the gas or oil. In April 1951, this stage had been reached at the rig site known as North Sapid No. 20, and around the location new notice boards proclaimed, "Danger, drilling in," for it was already known that North Sapid well No. 20 would be a high-pressure gas producer with a surface pressure of around 2,430 pounds per square inch. But in drilling down into the earth's store cupboard to release her precious wealth, there is always the incalculable. In time, a driller will develop an almost uncanny instinct in feeling the action of the steel-toothed bit that is boring into the rock several miles below his feet. The smallest miscalculation can end in disaster, and on this occasion, man was to lose the first round of his fight against nature. For the first time in 40 years of the company's operations in the Persian oil field, fire broke out in one of the drilling wells. This was no ordinary fire. That evening, the surrounding country was lit by the flickering light of this midnight sun. The noise of the flames was such that within a quarter of a mile of the raging planet, it was impossible to speak. The air was foul and hotter than man could withstand. For the heat of the jet itself was estimated at some 4,000 million thermal units, enough to heat 2/3 of the homes of England. With no experience of fighting fires on this scale, the work of extinguishing this terrific conflagration was beyond the resources of those in the oil fields. A cable was sent to America, calling for Mr. Kinley, the world's most experienced oil firefighter, who within 80 hours traveled the 7,500 miles to Persia. Using the lee of the adjacent hills as a screen from the intense heat, gangs of Persian laborers worked round the clock to build an emergency road to the site. The wreckage of the well had caused a great horizontal tongue of relentless flame to bar all approach along the existing road from the south side. This tremendous task was completed in 4 days. It was also obvious that water would be wanted, millions of gallons of it. The normal supplies to the area were inadequate, and lengths of 6-inch pipeline had to be manhandled and laid over 22 miles of hills to bring the water from the Karun River. In the comparative cool of the hills away from the fire, the temperature was, as its usual, 110 in the shade. A small valley beside the drilling site was dammed with sandbags so as to form a reservoir. The water was pumped here from the Karun River to be pumped out again by the mobile fire tent. No sooner had Myron Kinley arrived than he announced his intention of going in to have a look-see. Tractors and bulldozers were modified by British and Persian technicians at North Sapid. Corrugated iron sheets were erected to protect the operators, and a special mobile canopy, maneuvered by a tractor, was made to Kinley's own design. It had a roof of corrugated iron, and sheets of asbestos blanketing were hung down on either side. Hoses would play thousands of gallons of water onto it, enabling Kinley to advance, under its protection, to the very seat of the fire. Meanwhile, volunteers were arriving to help in this coming battle. Drilling engineers, construction engineers, civil engineers, geologists, crane drivers and tool pushers, every man jack knowing his job. Without the skill and know-how of these men, nothing could have been done to extinguish the fire, and it would have burned uninterruptedly for many years. Once everything was prepared, Kinley gave the order, "Get wet." and that order was to hold good for many days to come. Everything and everybody had to be kept permanently drenched with water, for without water, a man would have perished within little more than 60 seconds. The firefighting unit then began to advance. Firemen, operating from behind portable screens, kept a constant deluge of water playing onto the canopy, while they, in turn, were protected by a continuous spray from the first base. By this means, Kinley was able to get very close to the well cellar, but not close enough, for further progress was blocked by stacks of drill pipe and casing which would have to be removed. With a continuous waterfall from the monitors onto the canopy, gangs of volunteers worked to chain together bundles of these pipes, which had sagged on their supports like candles in the sun. The tractor hauled them away to the rear. It had been decided to blast away the collapsed derrick and torn debris of the control gear that was spreading the flames round the well cellar. Now that a path had been made, it was possible to decide just where the charge would have to be placed. Again, the resource and experience of Byron Kinley were called upon for this seemingly impossible task. He decided to place a 40-gallon oil drum containing the charge into a water-cooled tank. The drum to be so positioned that the water in the tank would form a cushion and help direct the blast in the required direction. The 400-gallon water tank was welded onto the end of a long length of piping, which in turn was attached to a bulldozer. All this equipment was assembled under the canopy, within some 20 yards of the fire. Volunteers then began to carry the high explosive in 50-pound boxes to the shelter of the canopy. With an air temperature of 240 degrees, it only needed one man to trip and fall, and many lives would have gone with it. While the firefighting party were being evacuated from the site, the field superintendent himself packed the charges into the drum. The bulldozer then began to push the charge on the end of the pipe towards the well cellar, and the exploder was prepared for firing. The force of the explosion was to blow off the top of the wellhead and release over half a mile of 4.5-inch steel drill pipe lodged down the hole. Like a giant snake, it writhed and twisted in the air, thus giving a new version of the time-honored Indian road trick. The object of the explosion was achieved. The obstructions around the well had been blown aside, and a single column of flame ascended vertically over 450 feet into the air. It was now possible to approach the well from the original road, and all the firefighting equipment was brought round the back of the hills to the new site. More pipeline for water had to be laid, and a new dam constructed on the south side. By May 22nd, it was possible to pump thousands of gallons a minute onto the well cellar. Kinley had decided that the second stage of the operation should be another explosion, or bomb, to blow out the flame itself by blast. In doing this, a considerable danger existed of the gases reigniting on contact with the red-hot wreckage in the vicinity. Millions of gallons of water were sprayed onto the ground surrounding the site in an attempt to lower the temperature of the metal. Meanwhile, a second canopy was brought up, this one to hold the new bomb, which had to be suspended in the air some 10 feet above the gas outlet. A 500-pound charge of gelignite was placed in an oil drum, attached to the front of the canopy, and maneuvered towards the flame under a deluge of water to prevent a premature explosion. When the plunger was pressed, the flame was snuffed out like a candle. Difficulty, the heat of the fire, was now overcome. But for some days the hoses were kept going on the cellar to prevent the ever-present danger of a flashback. The still hot wreckage could easily ignite this 1,000-foot column of highly inflammable, dense gas that was screaming up into the atmosphere. First, the cellar itself had to be enlarged and excavated deeper to allow access to the casing. A full inspection of the site could then be made for the first time, 27 days after the blowout. Then began the long and difficult business of capping the well with its tremendous pressure of escaping gas. The two outer strings of casing had to be cut away. This by drilling a series of holes round the perimeter, while a continuous safeguard against fire was maintained. Once the casing had been cleared, and only the 8-inch pipe from which the gas escaped protruded from the cellar floor, it was possible to set the casing hanger in place. With considerable difficulty, it had to be passed through the tremendous pressure of the gas jet and lowered into position. The gripping device tightened, and the hole encased in the cement block. The casing hanger is a flanged collar which grips the pipe and forms a base for the great hydraulically operated Cameron valve. Both these units had been ordered by cable and flown out to Iran, the former from America and the valve from the United Kingdom. Next, it was the turn of the Cameron gate valve to go through the same operation. The valve was tethered down by steel hawsers in 4 different directions so as to prevent this 4.5 tons of metal from being tossed about like a ping-pong ball at a fun fair when suspended over the jet. Yet another danger made itself apparent at this stage. As soon as the metal touched the side of the gas jet, a violent spray of gas would be deflected. This was so powerful that it could pick up stones and rocks and dash them against any of the metal machinery in the vicinity. It only needed one small spark from a stone, and all those working on the site would have been engulfed in flames. Inch by inch, the valve was swung into position for the long hinge bolt. Once the bolt was in place, the valve was maneuvered over the jet, allowing the gas to rush upwards through its open orifice. Finally, it was lowered and bolted firmly in place. At last, the moment had come. Gradually, the valve was operated. The screaming roar became a whine. The whine became a whisper. And the whisper became silence. For the first time in 5 weeks, it was possible to speak and hear in the vicinity of what had been North Savage rig number 20.
At Ahwaz. In 1958, Ahwaz in southern Iran became the scene of one of the biggest, toughest oil well fires that ever burned. Ahwaz is an oil structure with a long, bad history. It begins in 1913, when Ahwaz number 1 well was cable drilled. Number 1 was abandoned with mechanical difficulties, and we now know that it was off the dome. Ahwaz number 2 was drilled 35 years later and probably hit the reservoir, but it too had to be abandoned with pipes stuck in the hole. Number 3 was abandoned in 1949, again mechanical trouble. 4 was suspended in 1951. 5, very near 3, was also suspended. It was reopened and became the deepest well in Iran at the time, 12,742 feet. it produced nothing but salt water. In December 1957, number 6 was spudded in and drilled cautiously through the known danger zones. It reached the reservoir uneventfully. On April the 13th, 1958, petroleum samples were shown to government and company officials. The first hopeful sign after 45 years. After the tests, drilling of number 6 was continued. The hole went deeper to 8,073 feet. Early in the morning of April the 19th, they were bringing up a core barrel, and then blowout. In another 5 minutes, it flashed into fire. The derrick with 8,000 feet of drill pipe stacked inside it collapsed in a rat's nest of hot steel. 2 derrickmen had ridden the safety slides down, and all the crew was safe. This blowout thundered for 65 days. Farmers harvested night and day under its glare. It was visible from 20 miles away in daytime. Women filled their water bags at puddles along the emergency pipeline. After the fire was out, the well spouted gas and vapor wildly over the district, and 2 villages had to be evacuated. The Emergency Control Organization, set up after a dawn inspection from the air, arranged its plan in 4 stages. Preparation, clearing the site, blowing out the fire and capping the well. First, preparation. Before midday, special equipment built for the RIG-20 fire at Nafta Safid in 1951 had begun the 100-mile road trip from Masjid al-Sulaiman. The National-Iranian Oil Company contributed equipment from the bomb blowout of 1956. Myron Kinley, a firefighter from Texas, was summoned to direct the operations. Pipeline crews began to lay 6-inch line across the desert plain and over a low range of hills to the Karun River, 33 kilometers away. On the banks of the river Karun, they installed 2 pumps. These pumps could deliver more than 500,000 gallons of water a day through 3 pipelines, the new 6-inch line and existing 4-inch water line and 3-inch fuel line. Near the well site, power shovels, bulldozers and drag lines raced against the completion of the pipeline to build reservoirs. Great earthen water tanks along a gentle slope 700 feet from the fire. Firemen sprayed bentonite cement slurry from foam generators onto the walls and floors to consolidate the earth and prevent the water from seeping away. And at the same time, an 8-inch water delivery line had been built. Valves and fire hose couplings were fitted along its length. It was assembled at a distance and hauled up to the fire. Later, new lengths were added, and it was hauled up several times again. Another water supply was opened up. Ahwaz number 5 well, which produced 200,000 gallons of salt water a day from the bottom of the oil reservoir. But suppose the battle at the surface should be lost. Quarter of a mile from the fire, another drilling rig began to arrive to make a relief well. The drilling mast came from Awajari and its equipment from other fields. The relief well would be drilled as a last resort against failure of the surface operations. was the plan. The relief well would be drilled at first straight and then slanted to within a few feet of the bottom of number 6. Heavy mud would then be pumped down the relief well. The gas flow would suck the mud into number 6. When the weight of the mud column overcame the pressure of the reservoir, the runaway would be checked. That was the plan. But in the end, the relief well was not used, for the fire was conquered when the relief well was only 3,602 feet deep. A central working area was established 1,200 feet from the searing heat of the fire. By this time, it was crowded with welders, fitters, and equipment. Track-mounted trucks were reinforced. Bulldozers and side-boom tractors were shielded with corrugated iron. Night and day, equipment arrived from the company's workshops. And soon, the pumps and pipelines were ready. 2 reservoirs brimmed with water. 1 million gallons could be stored. Later, another 2 reservoirs were built, raising the capacity to 2.5 million gallons. On the 5th day of the fire, Myron Kinley arrived. He greeted men he had known 7 years before at the Nafta Safit fire. Then he went on to inspect the preparations in every detail. Kinley has capped more wild wells than anyone else in the world. He knows that success depends on exacting advanced work. He ordered many changes, for this fire called for the huskiest tools that could be built. Finally, 10 days after the blowout, Kinley ordered the firefighting crews to rest till midnight. He made a last inspection. The phase of preparation had ended. Phase 2, clearing the site, was about to begin. Midnight on April the 29th. A bulldozer brought the fire shed down the approach road. For the first time, the firemen soaked in water advanced into the terrifying noise and heat to join battle with the monster. Working near the fire was only possible in the cool of the night, if you could call it cool. Nobody could measure the temperature near the fire. Thermometers just went out of business. But finally, the firemen were able to couple their hoses and direct their powerful jets of water. Of course, you cannot put out an oil well fire by pouring water on it. But the water from the fire hoses made it cool enough for wrecking to begin. Kinley's wrecking boom lumbered into the arena. It was pushed by a heavily shielded bulldozer running backwards. Kinley, standing on a platform over the blade, directed the driver by hand signals. Often, he was quite unable to see anything through the cyclone of fire that swallowed the end of the boom. Repeatedly, he shot the hook into the fire, dropped it and pulled it out. Sometimes he got nothing. Sometimes he got very little. More often, as the nights went by, he was successful, pulling a derrick leg or the traveling block and crown block clear of the inferno. On the 8th night, he was preparing to dynamite the wreckage when the platform and rotary table collapsed. The ground flames shrank and flickered out, and the main stream of the fire towered high into the air. once a new danger appeared. Unburnt gas was escaping and swirling through the area. When the wind changed to a dangerous quarter, operations had to stop. Then they could do nothing but wait and watch and pray. Day brought little relief. Equipment torn to bits in the night work must be rebuilt. New equipment must be devised. On May the 6th, wrecking by day as well as by night began with a new instrument, a rake on the end of a long boom. For dangerous pulls which might spray fire sideways, or where the load was too heavy for a single tractor, several tractors were used in tandem. And the wrecking tractor could be pulled out no matter how bad the going or obstinate the load. So the clearing phase went on, for days and then for weeks, in heat, danger and unrelieved strain. It was hard to believe that there could ever be an end to it. But by May the 18th, the gallant men could see that they had made progress. And all this time, the same crews that had drilled number 6 were feverishly pressing on with the relief well, knowing that their work might save the situation if all else failed. Kinley had decided to finish the clearing with an explosion. The bomb had 2 shells, an asbestos-covered cylinder fitting into a rectangular water jacket. This, he hoped, would take off one of the blowout preventers, which he could not shift otherwise. They waited 3 days for a fair wind. It came on May the 18th. 450 pounds of explosive had to be packed in that bomb box. Firemen flooded the packing area with water. Kinley hooked up the detonator circuit. And laid out the firing lines. The dynamiter stood up to his waist in explosive, packing the deadly stuff meticulously. But the most essential workers were sent away. Kinley pushed the bomb to the edge of the well cellar. The first explosion did more than it was meant to. It cleared some wreckage. It knocked off some of the valve gear and unexpectedly put the fire out. As they soaked the area with water, it seemed like the first bit of good luck since the blowout. But not for long. 51 minutes after the explosion, the fire flashed back. Some say from the ground, Some say from the air, where a stream of water had cut across the jetting gas. Doggedly, the work went on. In the construction yard, the capping valve was being assembled and tested. If the fire could be put out, this massive valve would be needed to shut the well in. And pressures would be alarmingly high, higher maybe than the ratings of the available equipment. But that difficulty was still in the future. The relief well was now at 2,910 feet. It was time to set the first whipstock, to bend the hole towards the bottom of the runaway number 6. And at the surface, phase 3, blowing out the fire, had begun. It was not to be easy. At the well site, Kinley was intent on putting out the fire without damaging the wellhead. He put a 350-pound charge in the air beside the fire on the end of a wrecking boom. The second explosion was a complete failure. The fire reignited at once. He prepared a third bomb with 600 pounds of explosive. This too he hung in the air. And again the fire was unshaken. Air shots were a waste of time. He had a bigger bomb made. Then he had to wait 3 days for a fair wind. At last he packed the bomb with an 800-pound charge and set it right against the wellhead. The fire was out. Everybody waited. It stayed out for just 10 minutes. On May the 27th and 28th, he made 2 more explosions against the wellhead. Neither of these was successful. Despair and defeat were very close. But a horseshoe-shaped bomb was under construction to fit round the wellhead. Rails had been made of slotted drill pipe to guide it. Only the flange and the mud cross remained on the wellhead, but a small flame from the mud cross was probably reigniting the gas. This was the last chance. The rails were dragged forward. Then the bomb was pushed up round the wellhead. The fire was out. And so, Phase 4, capping the well, began 47 days after the blowout. It was the most dangerous part of the job, for a chance spark anywhere might set the fire off again whilst defenseless men worked at the wellhead. The explosions had made a crater out of the well cellar. There was no flange, just naked casing broken off level with the bottom of the pit. For 4 days they labored to expose enough pipe for a flange to be fitted and to lower the floor of the whole site so that there was room to operate heavy equipment. The noise was like a continuous explosion. The threat of reignition added to the strain. They cut off the conductor box and began to hacksaw through the 18-inch casing. It took 2 days with men working in relays to get it off. Inside the 18-inch casing was a 13-inch casing with a collar on it. This collar would prevent the valve from seating properly, so they gripped it with casing tongues and span it off. A tractor and a team of men heaving it round. Now the base flange for the valve assembly was brought in. They coaxed it through the upsurge of gas. It was tricky. But in the end, it fitted. They jacked the flange into place and leveled it. Then they secured it with a set of slips and guide ring. A new road had to be made for the winch truck. On June the 18th, full of hope, they brought the valve assembly up to the well. One bolt was slipped into place to be a pivot. A gang of men hove the assembly round into a column of gas. The gigantic forces knocked the whole thing cockeyed, bent the 3-inch steel bolt sharply, and the assembly lay over on its side. A cloud of explosive gas drenched the area so that the men scattered in all directions. They had to take the valve off and also the flange, which had been damaged. A grim day and no progress. The top of the smallest casing, 9-inch, was hidden in the gas, but they thought that it was probably the cause of the trouble. So they decided to cut away the 13-inch casing which surrounded it. Finally, they hitched cables to it. They took the cables back to a tractor. The tractor pulled, and the top of the 13-inch casing came off. There was the 9-inch casing standing proud, its jagged, flattened ends spraying the gas into a fan. They assembled the pipe cutters again and went to work on the 9-inch casing. The men hauling back and forth from the shelter of a steel roof. In the end, that job too was done, and the wellhead was left clean, with the gas coming straight into the air. They brought the valve assembly forward for the second time to try to fit it to the base flange, which they had repaired, reset, and tightened. First attempt, the assembly bounced, shearing the bolt. But quickly a hold-down device was welded together, and the next morning, the 21st of June, the valve swung into place and seated. Sheets of gas and condensate squirted from the joint. But one by one, the anchor bolts were bashed into place. Of course, spark-proof tools were used throughout the job. Bronze hammers and spanners thickly coated with oil. As the men secured the bolts, the leaks subsided. A good day. Now the end was assured. The The next shift of men changed over all the bolts, using high tensile steel for the permanent job. Water lines were hauled out to connect the valve assembly to a cement truck. The valves would be closed hydraulically from the truck. June the 22nd. Kinley opened a small pressure test line, then a 4-inch side valve, and in less than a minute cut off the main jet and the side jets. £1,000 per then steadily dropped as water, mud and cement were pumped into the well. For Kinley and his colleagues, it was the end of another job, the end of one of their biggest jobs. The men who worked with them had earned their place in the legends of oilmen, for the evil fame of this blowout would spread over the world. But it was time to look ahead again. In 4 months, the site was rebuilt, a derrick erected, and the drillers took over. They reached a new record depth for Iran, testing a still lower reservoir. It is not known whether a producing field has been discovered, though the tests are giving hopeful results. But whatever may happen in the future, Ahwaz number 6 will be a famous exploration well, and the men who conquered it will not forget those 65 days.
At about 9:30 the night of June 10, 1950, the Pan American Production Company A.L. Holley Well No. 1 in the Reinecke field, Borden County, Texas, caught fire after being out of control for some 30 minutes. At the first plane to nearby Sweetwater was Myron Kinley, world-famous fighter of oil well fires, and Red Adair, his assistant, followed him in by truck. Detailed arrangements were made to rush to the scene a long list of special equipment. Bulldozers to excavate water pits to have a capacity of 50,000 barrels. More than a score of tank trucks to haul water from the Colorado River. Shields for cat and bulldozer drivers, fabricated from corrugated galvanized iron and 1- and 2-inch pipe. Individual protectors for the men working on the ground. Crews of welders for constantly needed fabricating work. A special water-cooled boom and hook rig brought in from Oklahoma, mounted on an AFI wagon from Kermit, Texas, and powered by a Caterpillar tractor from San Antone. No two oil well fires are ever exactly alike, and the needs are always highly specialized and endless in detail. Pumps, discharge line, manifold, and fire hose are needed to bring water to the location so the ground can be cool as workmen pack in winch lines to drag out various pieces of fiery hot equipment. This was to be the first step in the battle to kill the roaring blaze, for the presence of any red-hot debris would immediately reignite the oil or gas. Led by Myron Kinley and his assistant Red Adair, the men who actually fought the fire came from regular Newman Brothers drilling crews and roustabout gangs. Their courage and skill throughout this most dangerous and difficult operation matched the highest traditions of all men of the oil fields. Piece by piece, Loose items such as tanks and automotive equipment were pulled away from the well in a slow, tedious process which made days seem like years. Everything from cement trucks to prime movers for the rig had to come out. Then the hook was moved into the flaming area to grapple for the substructure and other parts of the rig. An extremely difficult task, for the operator must guide all movements by signals to the cat driver, who must operate the equipment in a backward position. Always painfully slow, but with a steadiness that gradually built into progress, the process of clearing away debris continued, each item silently giving its own evidence of the terrific heat. A troublesome ground fire further hampered operations, and as long as the wind blew from its prevailing southerly direction, it was impossible to remove some 7,000 feet of tubing and drill pipe. Close observation indicated that the rotary was in such a position as to divert part of the flow from the well downward before it blazed skyward. It could also be seen that the rotary slips were in place in the master bushing, and until they could be removed, there was little hope of killing the fire. As the clearing operations continued, efforts not photographed took place, and the inaccessible tubing and drill pipe was covered with dirt by using cats specially rigged with extension blades. The heat from such a blaze cannot be overemphasized, and the ability of men to work under such conditions was sometimes unbelievable. Although relief crews had been organized and sleeping quarters set up so the work could go on around the clock, human fatigue occasionally demanded a rest, usually just a short one, but sufficient to revive the cheerful, aggressive spirit so typical of all the men who took part in the operation. Special arrangements were made for food and drink, and it's interesting to note that cold milk quenched thirst more effectively than ice water. A voluntary ambulance, fortunately, was never needed. On the fourth day of the fire, in an effort to jar the rotary table loose, it was decided to use an 80-quart shot of gelatin. An oil drum was fabricated on the end of the boom, and the shot was placed in it to be kept submerged in water. Then came several tense moments as the drum was maneuvered into position under the south edge of the rotary table. With the shot in position and surrounded by fire, the order of the moment was to clear out. When the shot was discharged, it failed to bounce the rotary table out of position or to jar the slips or master bushings loose. So it was necessary to pull the equipment away and start thinking of some other method to knock the stubborn assembly from its position. After on-the-spot conferences, telephone calls, and special efforts on the part of Mr. John Newman, Army personnel came in with a 75mm bazooka, the famous recoilless weapon designed for tank destroying. After several tests, the bazooka was set up about 350 feet away, and a total of 7 shots were fired, the last few of which we see here. The last 2 shots apparently did the job, and in 2 tries with a grappling hook, the rotary was finally removed. Of course, everyone concerned was very appreciative of the Army's successful efforts. Although the shots had given sufficient impact to loosen the rotary assembly, close inspection revealed little damage done. Then came 12 more hours of tedious work to remove the blowout preventers and other debris from around the well opening. With all equipment cleared away, the ground fire was soon eliminated, and the flame began to shoot straight up. You will recall that the tubing and drill pipe near the well could not be removed and was covered with dirt. So on the 10th day of the fire, with the pipe so prepared, a 90-quart shot of gelatin was made ready and preparations got underway. The blaze was partially snuffed out for a fleeting second, but reignited quickly. 2 days later, another shot was tried. Still, the fire burned on, and it was decided that further efforts to shoot the fire out would be futile unless the molten tubing and drill pipe could be removed and the area surrounding the well flooded with water. It was then decided to attempt to place a stack over the 9 5/8 to 10 3/4 inch swedge on top of the casing in the well in an effort to get the flame as high up from the ground as possible and thereby reduce the heat in the immediate area of the well opening. The stack was made of 16-inch conductor pipe and was about 12 feet long. Then began the rugged process of getting the stack into position. This was a most difficult job. Even after it was positioned, the 12-foot stack apparently reduced the velocity of the flow, causing part of the oil to slip downward, creating considerable ground fire. Finally, when the stack was shortened to 8 feet, the ground fire was eliminated. Still, the heat was so intense, the drill pipe could not be removed. However, efforts to throw up a levee around the well were successful, and preparations were made for the next stage of the battle. It was thought that perhaps a stack equipped with a 13 3/8 inch gate valve with 3 4-inch outlets immediately below might be secured to the casing by using an overshot equipped with slips. This necessitated an attempt to remove the swedge from the casing by sawing with a wire line, which was not successful. So a 13 3/8 to 16-inch swedge with welded nut lugs was substituted for the overshot, and the stack was finally positioned over the casing with its lower end forced well into the ground at the bottom of the cellar. Meanwhile, preparations had been made for pumping some 1,500 sacks of cement into the cellar on top of the 16-inch swedge. A 50,000-barrel pit was excavated, and at the same time, 2 100-barrel tanks were made into separators and connected through 3 4-inch lines into a manifold. As the cement was pumped into the cellar, the slurry eventually covered the swedge and the 3 4-inch outlets. These outlets had been connected with 3 4-inch lines leading from the stack to the manifold, completing the hookup to the separators. Although all these lines were opened, there was no flow through them to the tanks in the pit, obviously due to the velocity of the flow toward the top of the stack. Although leakage occurred at the base of the stack, it was stopped temporarily from time to time by pumping in more cement. However, when the gate valve was finally about a quarter closed, oil began leaking badly around the base of the cement plug, and further efforts to control the well in this manner were abandoned. Early the morning of July 5th, mud guns sprayed huge volumes of water to cool the ground in a large surrounding area as a 100-quart gelatin load was prepared in another drum, then positioned with the boom. At 8:15 a.m., the shot was exploded. The fire was extinguished after roaring for 25 days. Previous to this shot, several important events had taken place. A wind shift had allowed the breaking up of the cement plug and its removal, and at the same time, the molten mass of tubing and drill pipe had been broken to bits and pulled from the area. Also, a levee about 100 feet in diameter had been thrown up around the well site, allowing this area to be flooded with water. The decision had been reached, too, that the well was to be capped with a casing head bowl containing split pack-off and slips and to be stripped into position around the casing. This was to be followed by the stripping of 2 spools and a 10-inch pressure-operated valve. After additional work to better condition the surrounding area, to reinforce levees and to get necessary equipment and tools, the process of capping the well continued. An A-frame on a tandem trailer was used to pull the stack from the cellar. Then work was delayed a short time due to the commingling of oil, gas, and water when the wind suddenly died down. However, work soon resumed as the wind came up again, bringing within reason the hazard of asphyxiation. Eventually, a 13 3/8-inch Braden head with 9 5/8-inch split slip and pack-off assembly was stripped over the 9 5/8-inch casing and secured with a clamp bolted to the casing just below the head. Then a plug of cowls to firm position around the assembly for the purpose of supporting the bowl when additional weight was added by stripping the spools and the valve over the flow. Later, a 10-inch gate valve was bolted in position. This activity took place after dark and could not be photographed. But after leaks were corrected, 50 barrels of water were pumped in against 1,200-pound surface pressure, followed by 450 barrels of mud. Final pressure at noon. Today, the Holley No. 1 flows through this same hookup. Serene now, but a rugged memory for a lot of right good oil field hands. Every man who worked there received a certificate, making him a member in the Royal Order of Fire Eaters, and expressing deep appreciation for his services in the heat and the hell at Holley No. 1.